Trinity Long Room Hub. My name is Ciarán Wallace, and I'm the Deputy Director of Beyond 2022, the Virtual Record Treasury of Ireland. But I'm also a modern Irish historian based at the Department of History here in Trinity, and so it's a great pleasure to have the chance to have a conversation today with Professor William J. Lowe. Born in Brooklyn, New York, Professor Lowe was Professor of History at Indiana University Northwest, and he stepped down as Chancellor at that university in 2020. He had previously been the Provost and Professor of History at the Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he served as Interim President in that same institution. He's held a number of senior academic positions in institutions across New York, Michigan and Ohio. Bill Lowe is no stranger to Ireland, or indeed to Trinity. Following his undergraduate studies at Michigan State University, he obtained a PhD in modern history from TCD in 1975, where he studied with the famous Professor Theo Moody. Bill returned to Trinity on a Fulbright Scholarship in 1990. His research in the field of modern Irish history often uses a wider contextual lens, as demonstrated in his monograph on the Irish in Mid-Victorian Lancashire, the shaping of a working class community. And his many research articles have appeared in premier journals such as Irish Historical Studies, the Irish Economic and Social History, Éire-Ireland and other international journals. Over half of these, and I've counted, reflect his scholarship and interest in the history of policing in Ireland. And it's a really fascinating aspect of Irish policing history that brings him to the Trinity Long Room Hub as a research fellow this year. So, Bill, to begin with, perhaps for people who aren't that familiar with Irish history or this particular incident in Irish history, your research project is entitled Distraction and Intelligence Failure, Ulster, April 1914. Can you fill in some of the background of what the context of that is?
Right, and thank you for your interest today, but also thank you to Trinity Long Room Hub for the opportunity for a visiting research fellowship, delayed by COVID, like everybody else. But it's a great opportunity for me to both reanimate my research, but also enrich it with some new skills. In 1914, really look at the period 1912 to 1914, it's the period of the third Home Rule Bill, for Ireland. There is a Liberal government in London that is willing to support, Home Rule. The Irish Parliamentary Party, of course, is very much behind it, and this excites a very strong resistance in particularly Ulster, but also among British Conservatives, against the idea of Home Rule, or at least of Home Rule being applied in Ulster. And that led to the organization of, first of all, the Great Covenant, resisting Home Rule, but also then more organized resistance, including plans for a provisional government, but also for a militia that was drilled, up to an extent armed, called the Ulster Volunteer Force. And the British government, the Irish administration, of course the Royal Irish Constabulary, had to confront, the reality of not only three-quarters of Ireland being very interested in Home Rule, but a very important part of Ireland being threatening to resist, including the possibility of violence.
So the story itself is an interesting and exciting story, and students of Irish history, it's one of those standout moments in that sort of revolutionary era. But the aspect of intelligence failure, which is what drew you to it, what led you to consider that as the topic, the failure of policing?
Well, April 1914 was the so-called Larne gun running incident, in Northern Ireland. Guns were run actually to three ports, Donaghadee, Bangor, and Larne, on the night of the 24th to the 25th of April. It was about 25,000 weapons and maybe 1 million rounds of ammunition. As a logistical project, it was significant. Both were numbers and the weight of what was coming in. And the Irish Constabulary and Customs missed it entirely. It seems pretty convincing that even though senior members of the Conservative Party in London were well aware of it, the police and the Irish administration were not. And these guns were unloaded successfully. The local police, in small numbers, attempted to find out what was going on. I was reading just the other day the account of a district inspector at Larne, who, of the evening, notices an awful lot of lights around the harbor. And of course, the lights were automobile lights. This is 1914, it would not have been that common. And when he and several constables and a sergeant went down to see what was going on, they were confronted by 700 UVF members who told them they couldn't go in there. And they counted, coming out, 229 cars at the point where they were doing that. So one of the interesting things is not only that they eluded detection when the actual delivery was going to take place, it may have been the first really large-scale mechanized automobile-based operation of its kind. The First World War did not start, for another several months, and there were an awful lot of horses still in the First World War. So the weapons were driven away and successfully, and the R.I.C, such as they were in local areas, were just kept away.
And these were all private cars, private lorries, private vans from individuals, from shopkeepers, traders, merchants in the Unionist community. So this must have been quite widely dispersed and known about, just for the sheer logistics of making so many trucks happen.
Minimally, hundreds of people needed to know about it. Yes.
I mean, there is this reputation that Ireland was very heavily policed. I know from work I've done myself compared to parts of Britain, very heavily policed at this time. And the idea of the R.I.C being firmly embedded in their communities, who are well established by this stage, 3/4 of a century by this stage. Is that a mistaken view, that they were well embedded and heavily policed, or how do you sort of begin to account for the missing of this huge activity?
Well, one of the things that really intrigued me about this particular incident, and frankly has bothered me for a long time, was that the R.I.C was, they took great organizational pride in their very thorough local knowledge. And they were reputed, of course, to be the eyes and ears of Dublin Castle, and where almost nothing was able to get by them. And I think to a certain extent that was justified. What is interesting about what happened at Larne is not so much, that Dublin Castle did not figure it out. I think Halpin showed in 1987 in his book The Decline of the Union that the intelligence system, such as it was probably better at filing than synthesizing. And what I'm seeing so far will probably continue to validate that. What interests me as a distinct intelligence failure is what happened at the local level, where these folks were meant to have a better grip on what was going on. And that's the part of it that intrigues me, not so much that Dublin Castle didn't get it, but the guys at the local level did not.
And just on that local level, so you have the UVF operating on the ground at a local level and the R.I.C operating at a local level. Where did the UVF, the reputation is they were particularly professional and particularly adept. I know from stuff I've read, for instance, around the 1912 Covenant, they seemed very modern business in their approach to it, PR of the whole Covenant arrangement. And I sort of assumed that ran forward to 1914. Were they so sophisticated, professional and efficient in how they ran it from their covert point of view?
Right. There's a book by Timothy Bowman called Carson's Army, and a couple of remarks in there are, first of all, that you wouldn't call the UVF a well-honed military instrument. They had their weaknesses, record keeping among them. The other thing was that the Larne gun running was not a perfect plan, not the best plan that had ever been devised. Clearly, though, it was good enough to succeed. And of course, that's where the analysis then of what creates an intelligence failure at this scale, where it's a large amount of weapons and ammunition, and clearly an embarrassment. One other thing, once again, just reading some of the contemporary material, through the weapons originated in Germany, in Hamburg, and consular offices in Germany actually had spotted a very large arms shipment that they assumed was going to go to Ireland. They even identified the ships that would probably be involved. And then they lost track of them. And there were telegraphs and letters back and forth between London and German ports. But this goes back to a good month before the actual running of the weapons. But they lost track of them, and then they were transferred between ships at sea and all that, but also the R.I.C. and Customs never got the word of when they were actually going to land.
That's interesting. So I mean, that notion of that's the day-to-day failure that's happening on the ground there, but now a century later, or more than a century later, like how are you approaching this research challenge? How are you attempting to investigate what went wrong?
Well, the source material, the main source material I'm using are the R.I.C.'s monthly confidential reports that come from the counties. The county inspectors send them in to Dublin Castle, and this happens every month. And they are, up to a point, pretty detailed. As something interesting starts happening, they get requested to provide more detail. And I'm seeing that as I work through it, that's the case. I'm looking at those reports from January of 1913, when the UVF was created, through September of 1914, when the First World War has started, and several months beyond the gun running. And I wanted to look to see if anything changed in the way intelligence was coming in or requested from the counties. And I'm about halfway through that, and looking for words and terms, but also numbers, where I can get them to not only do a more sophisticated analysis than maybe has been done before, but also to work in more visualization into what goes into an intelligence failure. But those data, where I started, actually would have to fit into some sort of framework. There has to be a way of looking at an intelligence failure from 1914 that does not involve logarithms or digital sources, but somehow draws on the scholarly research that's gone into intelligence failure before, much more broadly than some of the more particular examples.
Because I mean that must be a huge challenge, because these records are written. They're quite, for people who haven't seen them, they're regular enough, the county inspector's reports, and they do contain some figures, but they're quite descriptive, and they will vary from inspector to inspector, and so it's very much qualitative analysis, and you're trying to do quantitative, or at least get some quantitative out of that qualitative.
It will be narrative, qualitative, and a quantitative analysis to the extent that is possible. You make an interesting point that month to month, county to county, all the data are not consistent.
Yeah.
Although later on, I think, later on in the decade of revolutions, that becomes probably a little more precise and consistent. But one of the interesting parts of the study has been putting together a framework, adapting the framework from other work that should be able to visualize when it is completed, but that does draw on this larger scholarly context. And I want to credit some of my colleagues in other departments at Indiana University. I teach in 3 schools and 4 departments. Cross-disciplinary teaching does give me some contacts with folks who know things that I need to know more about. And 2 of my colleagues were collaborating on a project on terrorism. And so I asked, what can you tell me about intelligence failure? Terrorists, of course, rely on intelligence failure. They sent me a good list of sources that I was able to look at and start developing some ideas. And if I could, I might develop that a bit, because it really shows the method and perhaps what this research may contribute
Okay, and the interdisciplinary nature of that is very much in fitting with the context of where we're sitting right now, so yes.
And it might add something to our understanding of a significant event in Irish history, but also how do we look at intelligence failures, particularly much older ones than Pearl Harbor, for example, like this one. And so, first, one of the purposes of intelligence is to minimize, unpleasant surprises rather than 100% prevention. And if you think about the accountability regimes in which we exist, they're not always that realistic. In other words, it is assumed you're not going to catch everybody. But also, the overall effectiveness and efficiency is going to depend on the character of the process, procedural, but also the policy environment. Things like how, as an organization, is it very conservative? Is it very hierarchical in its relationships? What are the communication styles to both receive, but also how do you respond to what is usually going to be bad news? And I think that the Dublin Castle policy environment likely contributes to the possibility of intelligence failure, particularly when you look at the system such as it was in 1914, how it functioned. Also, a critical element is confidence that people have in warnings. And by far the largest investment in any intelligence system is in data collection. And on the ground, the data collection is often regarded to be pretty reliable. And, but also reflecting that large commitment to collection, there's always lots of data, plenty of it. And of course the R.I.C., I think, would very much reflect that. But of course the source of the volume of information that is inherently diverse, it's ambiguous, it's contradictory, it's a heavy volume that comes in. And the steady daily piles of such data complicate working life for the intelligence analysts. And what it does is it favors both an analyst but also decision makers' intuition and preconceptions, which of course can feed hesitancy. And so another dilemma is that the receptivity of a system to even data-driven warnings decreases with variance from, first of all, preconceptions, but also policies that are in place. And this tendency is reinforced by the effect of false alarms and the regularity with which nothing happens, which is most of the time. And I'm suspecting at this point it's going to be very pertinent to what happened in 1914. And I think about some of the other characteristics they're confronted with when they're analyzing. It's all fragmentary, it's voluminous, it's complex, and it's not surprising that folks in the business would call all of that noise. And the noise is amplified by deliberate deception, misinformation, misdirection, and the simple ability to keep a secret, all to preserve surprise.
And those sort of like noise, the idea of noise and intelligence noise is very much a modern thinking. That's what if you watch documentaries about the CIA, the FBI, or any state's security services, but to apply that historically, I think is a really interesting way to approach it and to try and use that. But obviously you can't just pluck that methodology off the shelf and apply it historically. How have you kind of converted it or adapted it to fit the kind of sources that you're dealing with?
Well, it's these factors that I'm pointing out get built in as assumptions. In other words, things that are going to affect the system. And they are almost entirely human. For example, the R.I.C. was very good at accumulating noise and filing it. And so they had quite a lot of it. And some of it can be forwarded up the line. And it turns out, at this particular time, an awful lot of it was indeed being shown to undersecretaries and chief secretaries and the like. But in the noise, there can also be what they call signals. The signals
What's the important?
are accurate,
Yeah.
they're important, but in the case of a successful surprise, and surprise is usually successful, at least initially, if you have a successful surprise, the signals are only discernible historically. And we already know, what has gone on. And so I'm also looking for signals in the Irish noise, and Ireland was a pretty noisy place, in 1914.
Speaking of historically, the signal is only evident historically. So immediately after this failure, which the R.I.C. themselves must have seen as a failure, did they drill down and say, what did we do wrong? Did they have a report? Did they have an internal investigation into what they missed?
Yeah, I'm looking at that right now, and I've purposely left April and May 1914 to the very end. I want to see how, if at all, things change, coming up to that. But I am reading some other documents, and there was they were asked for reports. There were statements from customs officers and R.I.C. people who were on the scene, which pretty much tell the story with which we are very familiar. And there's just some of the other structural barriers that preventing unpleasant surprises. And they're all, once again, very human factors. And they include preconceptions and the dulling impact of routines, focus on intent versus capabilities, and failure to appreciate how quickly things can change, and the conviction, despite data, for example, about capabilities, that it cannot and it would not happen, and the daily uncertainties that are produced by the stresses of limited time and staffing in the face of a continuous flow of ambiguous data. Noise. In other words, surrounded by noise and not much time.
And then the process that these county inspector reports are distilled down into an Inspector General's report, which gets fed up to the top of the tree. And that reminded me a lot of, just by sheer chance, having spoken with Bill last week in preparation for this, by sheer chance I was listening to a YouTube talk on the evolution of the President of America's daily intelligence briefing over time, and how this document changes, and it changes very much depending on the personality of the President. But the point that took in conversation that, in a sense, the system has a personality. The system of both collecting, gathering, distilling, and feeding, and who's at the top, becomes like a personality. Would that be correct?
Well, I think, as I mentioned to you, I think that's a good characterization. Once again, these are human systems, and that's the way we interact with human systems. In the case of the President of the United States, clearly if you're looking for a strong personality who has particular preferences or the absence of them, intelligence reporting will feed to that. In the case of 1914, both the Dublin Castle administration and the administration in London, you would have to characterize as sort of a collective personality, but that was actually fairly consistent between the levels. And I think both Unit and Halpin's work on the decline of the Union, but also Ronan Fanning's Fatal Path, are good ways of showing that a personality wanting to avoid a lot of trouble and not upsetting people and the like, particularly folks who have just imported 25,000 rifles, is something that's characteristic on both levels there of the administration. But once again, you can call it a personality. There was quite a consistent approach or non-engagement with some pretty significant problems.
Just stepping back into the day itself, at the period itself at the time, I mean, this was summer 1914. The UVF was, a year and a bit old. Things are very tense across Ireland, particularly tense in Ulster. Surely the R.I.C. were on high alert. I mean, how could they miss this on a practical level? You sort of think this must be blindly obvious because they're on alert.
Yep. They were, on alert. One of my early, I call it something between a presupposition and a hypothesis, was that because of the routines, the formats of their reporting, that the R.I.C. may not have looked the other way at the gun running, but they may have been looking in the wrong places, looking someplace else. And That turns out not to be the case at all. They were watching the UVF and its development and for evidence of gun running and arming very intently from 1913 right up to the point of the large armed shipment. And their monthly reports, even though they spent a lot of time and attention on the UVF, what they were also looking at were landlord-tenant relations. They had to report on that every month. Evictions, agricultural prices, how the crops do this year.
The movement farmers.
The labor relations, the tone of the press, what the local press was saying or not saying. And that's even aside from what I call the indictable activities of ordinary decent criminals, who were also had to have their reports. And so there was quite a lot of attention, though, given the fact that there were so many other things to report.
So, given that, and so in a sense, you're sort of facing the same challenge that the Inspector General faced back in 1914, how to make sense out of all this noise. As a historian, what do you do with all this to make it measurable or analysable?
Right. And the Crime Branch Special System, intelligence system at Dublin Castle, the county inspector's reports were just one part of that. And they came in every month for every county. In some there were 36 of them in all. Some of the counties were divided into ridings, and Belfast was its own district. But I don't know if you can see this as photo. It's a photo of a stack of paper, and which I took a couple of weeks ago over at the National Archives of Ireland, because that it's there at all is a mistake. All of these are meant to be a queue. But this is from 1908, and it just happened to be in a box. They're all clipped together, but this is 1 month's monthly reports. Vary usually from 175 to 200 pages. It is almost entirely handwritten manuscript, and somebody every month had to make sense, of all of that. And this was only part of what was going in to Dublin Castle.
The notion that and this is like sidebar, but the notion that the R.I.C. might have been colluding with the UVF, given that they were all sort of unionist in mindset and so forth, have you come across any evidence for or against that idea?
No, and I don't know that anybody else has. And the statements that one sees, of district inspector on the side of the road waving to folks he knows as they drive past, with their load of guns, what the statements from the night when customs officers and R.I.C. officers were debriefed, they seem to have been genuinely surprised. It doesn't mean that somebody didn't know about it, but nobody's ever said anything, about that. I mean, nobody's ever decided to own up and talk about that. And say, if I could just, some of the ideas that go into my framework, these very human obstacles to preventing a nasty surprise. And I mentioned some of these, but also the ability to keep a secret. Is particularly the lone terrorist. If a lone terrorist keeps a secret, of course, he's going to be creating a surprise. But it does seem that the Unionists were pretty good at keeping a secret. And nobody has ever come up and said, well, I kept the secret and I could have told the sergeant, but I did not. Nobody has ever come out with anything quite like that. And the R.I.C. statements that I've seen are pretty much, this was a big surprise on the time it happened.
The notion, for people not familiar with the reports, very often they list the different organisations that they're concerned about, whether that be the UVF or the Sinn Féin or later the Irish Volunteers or Labour Trade Union. They have a little listing and they say very active or quiet, or depending on the particular inspector involved. But I think you were commenting in an earlier conversation we had about the fact that they're saying at some point they start to say it's not easy to get information about this, that they're aware that there's a barrier.
Right.
which is
And,
not standard.
you know, I looked ahead in some of these reports to create my data entry, code book. And, one of the data points that I'll look at is comments by the R.I.C. that we can't get information.
Yeah.
And that is starting to appear a little bit more as time goes on. And, it's quite a regular statement. We think this is going on. We have a reliable, or used to be a reliable informant, but we can't confirm it.
Can you interpret that as a self-realization of intelligence failure, a self-reflection intelligence failure at the time on their part? Were they somehow flagging the fact that we're not getting this intel?
Right, they're flagging it, and of course it's remarked by other writers on the period that, and I can see a variety of reasons for this, but there really wasn't a whole lot of probing, about the UVF or the leadership. Some of which, of course, quite prominent people, in the British establishment, but also the ambiguity created by, the loyalists, the Queen's rebels, if you like.
I was wondering, and this might not be, it might not fall within your research parameter, but just it struck me afterward. Is there any continuity between certain senior R.I.C. officials in 1914 and do they become something senior in the R.U.C. post-partition in 1921-22? Do any of them could you infer an earlier political identity by where they ended later?
Yeah, I have not done that, or at least not yet. I do have the data if I wanted to do that. In the period of 1913, 1914, officers in the R.I.C. were predominantly Protestant. The article I wrote in 2005 about the R.I.C. officers, which looks at it's a census of their personnel records. The real openings, for the movement of Catholics into the officer ranks really comes with the First World War, with secondments, fatalities, and so the promotion system begins to open up. They were predominantly Protestant, and the district inspector, county inspector reports that I've seen don't betray, anything like that, or nothing that you would not expect.
Is there any relevance in the Curragh Mutiny, or the so-called Curragh Mutiny, which is March of 1914?
March.
So a number of months before, where the British military, well, the complicated story, where the British military more or less say, if we were ordered to go north to enforce Home Rule on Ulster, we would decide not to, or we would not follow that order. It was never actually ordered. But that's, again, you can link thematically that with the gun running. Is there any linkage in your mind?
And I don't know yet. It could be the sort of thing that adds to noise. It's a distraction and something that people are looking at. Although it's interesting, from an earlier period, 1913, latter part of 1913, the county inspectors are reporting comments among Unionists and the UVF that they really are not so worried that the British Army would ever move against them. And this is months before the Curragh Mutiny. So it certainly would have complicated the environment. Where exactly it fits in, I do not know at this point. But there are some comments, from the counties that there is some thought early on that they could count on the British Army not to move against them.
And then you wonder if that's social connections, or these retired ex-British military were involved in training, the UVF and so forth, so what were the networks. The other thoughts then on, how do you take this information and what's the output from? You're doing what sounds to me like a really challenging job converting. And sorry, a lot of these things are on microfilm. It's not always nice, neat paper you're reading. A lot of these are on microfilm, which is the right pain to read, which let me assure you. Which are not only the medium, but the content, converting it into something that's then measurable. Have things changed? You were starting on this project, it began, as you said, somewhere between hypothesis and supposition some years ago. But has the research environment changed, of what you're doing, how you're approaching it, tool-wise and skill-wise, has that changed?
Well, I've had a wonderful relationship over the years with microfilm. I'm looking at some of the younger faces in the room who may not know what that is. One of the way things changed is the copies of the county inspector's reports that I'm using are digitized. So I got them from the UK National Archives, so I have them digitally. And so I'm not struggling with microfilm, except when I'm over at the National Archives. But it's handy enough that they are there rather than have to go to Kew. Also, before digital tools became quite as available and user-friendly as they are now, I have a good deal of experience of converting manuscript sources to databases. And some of them are very large. The database for the domestication of the Royal Irish Constabulary had nearly 7,000 cases. It was all the constabulary officers. Another project I did was to look at a 20% sample of black and tans, for example. So this is something I had a good deal of experience with before really good digital humanities tools became available. So the way this has changed, not only how you can access materials, is of course much easier and much more flexible, but also it has encouraged me to look at how to go beyond charts and graphs, quantitative representations to other kinds of visualization. And so that has certainly changed. And once again, I thank the Hub for giving me the opportunity to work on this and begin to develop it a little more richly.
It can be very powerful. I mean, visualizations as a gateway into complex information. I mean, it's something I've only converted to recently. Have you any particular examples in mind, not to show, but ones to describe? I mean, is there a particular tool that you would like to?
Well, an example I could cite is something you're all very familiar with, something as simple as a word cloud. And I'd never done one before. And so a few weeks ago, I put the text from my data code book, just words, text, into Voyant Tools, and did a word cloud. And this is a picture of it. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a word cloud. And of course, the frequencies are reflected in the size and the distribution of the words. And I found that very meaningful for maybe representing noise in anybody's system. But also, it was meaningful to me because I can remember days in administration that looked a lot like what I just showed you. And that there was discrepant, incomplete information, and not enough staff or time to really make a good go of a sensible, solid, defensible decision. So among the things that have bothered me about the R.I.C. failure in 1914 is I take an organizational viewpoint, and I'm interested in the quality of decisions. And of course, decisions that occur or do not occur. And so that's another interest of mine, and how a digital tool has already helped me to be pretty convinced that this is a real project and might actually contribute something.
I mean, the more you talk about it, the more convinced I am that you're right. To develop this as a tool, it'll be fascinating to see what it says about this particular incident. But you could imagine then that being applied to 1916, 1919 to 21, even earlier back to land war. Like decision making, we tend to, well, certainly I, my own feeling as a historian, you look at what the decision was and you move on, rather than saying, well, what's the quality of that decision?
Yeah. And I have no idea if anyone else will find it interesting or useful at all. One of the things about this particular study is it's older than most of the intelligence failures that are studied. So what I'm doing is something that's adaptable historically. As I said before, logarithms and artificial intelligence and that sort of thing. So I don't know. 1916 has occurred to me. That was another intelligence failure, but of a different sort. And so I don't know how comparable they would be ultimately, or anybody, or this framework would be found useful.
On a sort of micro level, if you're faced with a county inspector's report which is, let's say, 30 pages long and it's just full of manuscript and descriptive text, how do you capture a data point in that? What's your actual steps? Are the 3 steps to what you do, just for people who may not have done that task?
Yeah, it's drawing on experience that I already have with creating these databases from manuscript. The one has to make decisions up front about what's important and to apply those decisions very consistently. And things that fall too far outside of that, well, that becomes qualitative data perhaps, and none of it is lost. But I did do 3 months before I came just to see what sort of things I might look for, and did up the rudiments of what would be my code book. And so far, I'm about halfway through it. 2 months later, it's holding up rather well, and any little adaptations can actually be made into the spreadsheet is sufficiently flexible that I can do that. So it does take a certain amount of discipline and to recognize that it might not all turn out to be what one might hope or think that it might turn out to be. But that's simply the way I do it.
So when faced with a large corpus of material, you take a small sample and try out your codebook method on it and see does it stand up, and then extrapolate that.
That's what I did. Yeah.
So as you read through, you're looking for mentions of arms, mentions of cars, mentions of we can't get information, and reporting those.
And a variety of other things as well. The frequency of meetings. Are there who's holding the meetings? Who? How many people are showing up? That part of it, I'm finding data to record. But of course, that is all over the place, and it's some county inspectors will report that 5,000 people came to hear Edward Carson. Somebody will say it was a really large meeting, and of course that does not help you to pin that down. So we'll see if in these latter months things get a little more specific. Parts of it just simply will be informative, but not terribly useful.
How reliable do you think some of the figures are? They put down these county inspector reports. 37 people turned up to the trade union meeting. At the next, there are 103 members of the Farmers Union, and the next month 103 members, and the next month 103 members, and you're thinking there's no constable without counting these heads. What do you think of it?
Yeah, and others have commented about this, like Michael Laffin when he was for the Sinn Féin period, and it's hard to know. Initially, there's probably some effort to pin it down. Later on, running out of time, there were 5,400 members of the United Irish League at 30 branches last month.
Yep.
And as you say, next month it will look a lot the same. Although they did make efforts because, particularly at this period, when UVF or Unionist Club branches are forming, they're catching it. So a new club is formed in a particular town, and so they record that. So they had some availability of specific information. Most of it is probably guesswork. They're doing their best.
The arrival of this huge shipment of arms, did that just sort of arrive, from the police's point of view, it could be that to arrive out of nowhere. Was there any precursor to this or any earlier flagging? I mean, it's been very successful for a first outing.
As I said, I'm looking for signals, and very early on, one of the months that I looked at was March of 1914 to develop my method. And there was an incident reported in Belfast, and it was believed to be. And that's another thing I'm trying to track. Confirmed sightings of arms, suspected. So those are separate variables. That was a smaller shipment of arms delivered at a dock, in Belfast.
In March.
And, March of 1914. That was driven away in private automobiles. A signal, maybe. But as I'm reading other things, the Unionists and the UVF, the automobile was prominent with them. Even down to paying attention to when Edward Carson arrives in an automobile,
Yes.
followed by 25 automobiles full of dignitaries and hangers-on and the like. So the auto, was important. And I don't know, if there's a way of finding out how many registrations there were in 1914 in Ulster, but a significant proportion of those autos must have been in action the night of 24th and 25th April.
And that points to two things when doing research, I suppose, is because we're so acculturated to automobiles that we wouldn't even think to mention their existence in a gathering now, but to put ourselves into the mindset of the period and say, the journalist mentioned this, or the police mentioned this, so it is significant to them, and to get into that mindset. But the other issue is sort of the periodization. When do you begin? You chose to begin in March. Had you begun in June, you wouldn't have picked up that possible signal of that earlier shipment, but you chose to begin in March. Was there any logic as to when did you, obviously you have to limit, you've only limited amount of hours in your day, how did you arrive at March as the starting point for the lead up to?
I was just looking for, three they weren't really random dates to get an idea of what the R.I.C. was looking at the local level. I like the county inspector's reports because they're pretty close to what the R.I.C. was looking at on a day-to-day basis, including all those other things that they were supposed, including nationalists that they were supposed to be tracking. So I did the first month of the UVF. I did October of 1913, and I did March of 1914.
Okay.
And so far, that has served my database pretty well.
And if you had, 5 supporting research assistants, would you change the parameters of this, or do you think you've actually got the framework that will produce the results you need for it? I'm so far satisfied with it, and what we'll have to see is what I've got at the end. How many gaps in data that I have, how much of it is useful. Useful for, let's say, a visualization or even a quantitative treatment. And so I won't know that, for a while. At this point, I haven't seen anything that I would consider not useful or informative around this. But what it'll all add up to, that I have to write about. Well, we're only halfway through, so that's okay. And in your, one of the other hats you wear is lecturing in police history in the United States, and that you've researched on. Do you find that the R.I.C. is a standard policing organisation for that period, or does it seem very different? And I know you've worked on social history of Britain and the Irish and Lancashire and stuff. Does the R.I.C. stand out as a very different thing, or is it just another Western police force, as you'd expect to see?
Well, that was interesting. A couple of years ago, my department asked me, because they knew of my interest in policing, to develop a course on the history of American policing, and which I taught for the first time last autumn. And of course, you'll be surprised to hear that somehow the Irish Constabulary gets into that history. And part of it, is the great influence of Robert Peel, who the Metropolitan Police in London had a great influence on the early days of American policing. But Robert Peel also, before he got around to London, of course, founded the Irish Constabulary. And so, we take a look at the Irish Constabulary as the two dimensions of what Robert Peel did. One was what I call metropolitan policing, and the other is colonial policing. And of course, the model for colonial policing was the R.I.C. The R.I.C. may not be the best example of colonial policing, but it was the model. And so I use the colonial policing, not the R.I.C. necessarily, but I use colonial policing as a metaphor for the way of relationships in communities between, let's say, particularly a community of color and the police in the United States. The experiences, and I give them characteristics of colonial policing, is the experience more attuned to what you call metropolitan policing or colonial police relationship. So I would say the Irish Constabulary is very important in American police history.
That's very interesting to hear. And then post-independence then that so many R.I.C. will go out to mandate in Palestine and to other parts of the colonial structured empire to police there. That's very interesting, that connection. What do you think will be, at the end of your research period, at the end of your fellowship here, what's your intended output from this? Is it publication or further research?
It will be an article, at least one article, and that's the plan at this point. And I think it would make at least one substantive article.
The question is, do you put that into a history journal, or do you put it into a policing journal, or is it into an administration journal, because it seems to fit so many different
I'd probably be looking at an Irish history journal of some sort, but we'll see where the interest is when it's finally finished.
I think it's a fascinating project, and the idea of this methodological tool, this framework that you're developing, I think is really interesting. Just in wrapping up there, I know there's a couple of acknowledgements you possibly wanted to, to give to people who work with you in your time here.
Yeah, and once again, I'm very grateful to the Long Room Hub for this opportunity. It's about being able to think about some research, get some real work done, but it was also about meeting people and getting some help. And so I've had good consultation with Jennifer Edmond, and who told me that flying tool is really easy. You can do it. But also Peter Crook and Dave Brown at Beyond 2022. Of course, we've had a good chat, as well. And this has been very helpful in trying to add that visualized dimension to my research. But another acknowledgement I want to make is that I had some help with my Excel database from John Hazlett, who was able to be with us today. And of course, he's retired as professor of statistics here at TCD. And he's been helping me try to figure out what I'm actually trying to do in my research for almost 50 years. So thank you, John, for coming, but also for your friendship and the patience, over the decades. But yes.
Very good, excellent. So at that stage there, I think should we wrap it up? Are there questions? Do you see questions from the audience normally, or we?
We have one question, maybe.
Oh, sorry.
It was a brief comment. Thanks very much.
First, you know, help them.
I only have about 3 hours. So a couple of things. One is, can you look at one gun running without looking at the other? Can you look at Larne in terms of the police performance without looking at what happened at home?
It happened. I'm sorry. One of my hearing aids went.
Can you look at Larne in terms of police intelligence failures, if you like, without looking? I'm not saying you can't, but can you? Another is a general comment, which I would argue that in intelligence terms that Larne gun running is an imperial failure. The guns are coming from Germany, about which the imperial defence in particular, one element which has emerged in pre-First World War British government precisely to pull things together at a strategic level. They're worried, fearfully worried about Germany. And as you say, they also have the consular information coming in as well as intelligence material, very early intelligence. So can we separate the R.I.C's failings, apparent failings, from London's failings? And that applies equally, of course, to what happens at the end of July. Anyway, thanks very much. Your techniques are fascinating, and you're on to old tiger like me.
To your second question, I think one of the things I'm actually trying to do is separate the R.I.C., particularly in Ulster, on the local level, from that larger context. Because what concerns me is the R.I.C. was supposed to be better than that locally, in their communities. As we said, hundreds, if not thousands, of people knew about this plan. Apparently, the R.I.C. locally did not. That's what interests me. I think you've done a good job. I think expanded on by Roman Fanning about that larger context that was indeed an imperial level failure. And could this, if I understood the first question, can this framework be used, or when I look at something else? I think yes. I've been away from research for some time now. This particular question is what has frankly bothered me, and so this is where I'm starting, and where else I might go, I don't know at this point. but it would be an approach that I think would be adaptable elsewhere, if that's your question.
Yeah, well, I think you figure point about the whole gun earlier, because obviously that came also as a surprise.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's for another day. Thanks, Rick.
And thanks for coming.
So, another question here?
I'm thinking about your hope that this is useful and applicable in a larger context. I don't know much about the Irish context, but in a larger, perhaps, intelligence context. And I definitely think it could be. I think that by going back to a historical moment that isn't normally considered, you're going to allow analysts to be seeing their own assumptions about what the factors are that they need to consider. And as I was sitting here thinking about why, I always like to make the counter argument, why analysts might dismiss it and not think it's relevant, two things that might come to their mind are, in terms of noise and signals, that the noise today is so much greater, right? And also the rapidity of decision making is so much quicker. But I've heard you speak about this a few times, and it seems like the qualitative information that you're uncovering could actually speak to that. And I'm wondering if you're really emphasizing, for that larger view of maybe the analyst community, that these officers were under pressure. They felt enormous pressure to be churning out these reports. They had enormous amounts of data, that some of which is captured, some of which is not, to always be filtering. And by stressing that, maybe it would overcome that initial thought that this is, apples to oranges, and maybe see that it's more green apples to red apples.
I think that when this is finished, that part of it's going to get plenty of emphasis.
Right.
And because I have my own experience of heaps of data in a short time frame to come up with a decision. And in many ways not comparable to what was going on in 1914, but yes, you have to understand what the human beings involved were experiencing. And that this was a heavy workload. It was trying to keep track of a lot of things. And without necessarily, I think the other dimension is knowing what would happen above their level. For example, in 1913, 1914, the Inspector General is being pretty clear to the Undersecretary, this is a problem. This is serious. But we also know about the characters of both the Dublin administration and the cabinet at Westminster that didn't necessarily, penetrate. Even though the Inspector General turned out to be right. What strikes me about my little framework is it's fundamentally and very human. And of course the systems, such as they were, reflect that. So I think that particularly going through these reports, there's enough of the qualitative data that really emphasizes that. So thank you.
Thanks for those questions, and I think, Bill, your little framework might turn out to be a bit bigger than you are saying for it here. So
if it works for an article, I'll be satisfied, but if somebody else finds it useful, that'll be great.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and thanks to the whole for the opportunity to have this conversation, and so maybe a round of applause for